What if a warship was designed not just to fight, but to see? The Imperial Japanese Navy was obsessed with this very question. In the vast, empty expanses of the Pacific Ocean, finding the enemy before they found you was the key to victory. The answer to this obsession was a bizarre and brilliant hybrid, a warship with the heavy guns of a cruiser at the front and the eyes of an aircraft carrier at the back. This is the story of one of those ships, the Japanese cruiser Chikuma, a vessel whose unique design would place her at the center of the Pacific War's most critical and brutal battles, from the opening moments at Pearl Harbor to a desperate, lonely end in the chaos of Leyte Gulf. The story of the Chikuma begins not with steel, but with a problem. In the 1930s, Japan knew that any future war against the United States would be a naval war, dominated by the aircraft carrier. The Imperial Japanese Navy, or IJN, developed a powerful carrier strike force, the Kido Butai. But these carriers were a precious, finite resource. To use them effectively, they needed to know exactly where to send their planes. Sending them on fruitless searches wasted fuel, exhausted pilots, and worse, risked revealing the fleet's own position. The IJN needed a dedicated, long-range scout, a ship that could range far ahead of the fleet, find the American carriers, and report their location without giving the game away. Existing cruisers were expected to do this, but it was a clumsy solution. Launching scout planes from a standard cruiser meant cluttering the deck, restricting the firing arcs of their main guns, and creating a massive fire hazard from aviation fuel right in the middle of the ship. So, the naval architects were given a challenge. Build a cruiser that could scout and fight without compromising on either role. Their solution was the Tone class of heavy cruisers, and it was a radical one. Looking at the profile of the Chikuma, or her sister ship Tone, the design seems almost nonsensical. All four of her main gun turrets, holding a total of 8 powerful 8-inch or 203mm guns, were crammed onto the forward half of the ship. This super-firing arrangement gave her a ferocious forward punch, but left her completely unable to fire her main armament directly astern. This wasn't a flaw, it was a feature. By concentrating the guns forward, the entire rear of the ship, from the superstructure back to the stern, was transformed into a dedicated aircraft handling facility. This was Chikuma's secret weapon. It was a spacious, well-organized platform for launching, recovering, and maintaining a small air force of up to 8 reconnaissance float planes. She was equipped with 2 powerful aircraft catapults and a comprehensive system of rails and cranes to move the aircraft around. This clear separation of roles was revolutionary. The gun crews could operate without worrying about fragile aircraft, and the aviation crews could work without dodging the muzzle blast of giant naval guns. Chikuma was laid down at the Mitsubishi shipyards in Nagasaki on October 1, 1935, and commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy on May 20, 1939. She was a formidable vessel. Displacing over 15,000 tons when fully loaded, she could slice through the water at an impressive 35 knots, or about 65 kilometers per hour. This speed was essential, allowing her to keep pace with the fast carriers she was designed to protect. Her armor was decent for a cruiser, designed to protect her against the 8-inch shells of her counterparts. She also carried a heavy anti-aircraft battery and a dozen potent 24-inch long lance torpedoes, a weapon that was arguably the best of its kind in the entire war. But her true power lay in her Nakajima E-8N Dave and HE E-13A Jake floatplanes. These were her eyes, extending her vision across hundreds of miles of ocean. Assigned to Cruiser Division 8 with her sister Tone, Chikuma was immediately put to work with the carrier fleet. She was the perfect tool for the job. As 1941 drew to a close and Japan prepared its masterstroke, Chikuma was given one of the most important missions of the entire opening phase of the war. She sailed as part of the Kido Butai, the 6-carrier strike force steaming in secret across the North Pacific. Their destination? Pearl Harbor. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 7, 1941, the fate of the world hung in the balance. Before the first bomber roared off the flight deck of the carrier Akagi, a single float plane was flung from the catapult of the Chikuma. Its mission was critical: a final weather reconnaissance over the island of Oahu and, more importantly, a last-minute confirmation of the location of the American fleet. The pilot's report crackled back across the radio. The American battleships were there, sleeping at their moorings in Ford Island. The report confirmed there were no American carriers in port, a crucial piece of intelligence, but the primary targets were present. The attack was on. Chikuma's aircraft had provided the final green light for one of history's most infamous surprise attacks. While the bombs rained down on Pearl Harbor, Chikuma and Tone stood guard with the fleet, their guns ready for any American counterattack that might emerge from the chaos. With the U.S. Pacific Fleet reeling, the Japanese war machine rolled across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Chikuma was at the tip of the spear. In early 1942, she supported the invasions of Rabaul in New Britain and Lae in New Guinea, her float planes scouting ahead, ensuring the landing forces were unopposed. She then took part in the devastating attack on Port Darwin, Australia. But her next major operation would take her far from the Pacific into a new ocean. In April 1942, Chikuma sailed with Admiral Nagumo's carrier force into the Indian Ocean. The goal was to smash the British Eastern Fleet and disrupt Allied shipping lanes. For several weeks, they ran rampant. Chikuma's planes were constantly in the air, hunting for prey. They located two British heavy cruisers, the HMS Cornwall and Dorsetshire, which were then promptly dispatched by Japanese dive bombers. Days later, they found the old British light aircraft carrier HMS Hermes, which met a similarly swift and violent end. During this raid, Chikuma also participated directly in the sinking of several merchant ships and helped hunt down the American destroyer, the USS Edsall. The Edsall fought valiantly, dodging shells and bombs for hours before finally succumbing to the overwhelming force. The Indian Ocean raid was a stunning success, and Chikuma had proven the incredible value of her hybrid design. 2 months later, she would find herself at the battle that would change the course of the entire war. Midway. Once again, she and Tone were tasked with their primary role, scouting ahead of the 4 carriers of the Kido Butai. In the hours before the battle was joined on June 4, 1942, both cruisers launched their float planes to sweep the ocean for the American fleet. Chikuma's scout plane flew its pattern without spotting anything. History, however, would pivot on the actions of the scout from her sister ship, Tone. That plane's launch was delayed by 30 minutes due to a catapult issue. This seemingly minor delay meant it arrived over the American fleet's position later than planned. Its subsequent sighting reports were also delayed and initially vague, contributing to the confusion on the Japanese flagship Akagi that prevented them from launching a decisive strike against the American carriers before they themselves were attacked. As American dive bombers from the USS Enterprise screamed down and turned the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu into funeral pyres, Chikuma could do nothing but watch in horror. She survived the initial onslaught, and later that day, her float planes helped locate the sole remaining American carrier, the USS Yorktown. This information led to a Japanese strike that would cripple the Yorktown, though it would ultimately be sunk by a submarine. Chikuma, along with the rest of the shattered Japanese fleet, retreated from Midway, having lost 4 of its best carriers in a single day. The tide of the war had turned, and the grinding, attritional warfare that Japan could not win was about to begin. The new focal point of the Pacific War became a jungle-choked island in the Solomon Islands chain, Guadalcanal. For months, the U.S. Navy and the IJN would bludgeon each other in the waters around the island. In August 1942, Chikuma was present at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, a vicious carrier duel where both sides traded heavy blows. Again, her scout planes were invaluable, locating the American carriers and allowing the Japanese to launch the first strike. The battle was largely a draw, but the Americans held Guadalcanal. 2 months later, in October, came the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, another desperate clash of carriers. This time, Chikuma would not escape unscathed. She was steaming near the Japanese carrier Shokaku when the sky filled with American aircraft from the USS Hornet. Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers plunged towards the Japanese ships. While most targeted the carriers, a handful singled out Chikuma. 3 bombs were aimed at her. Her captain, Keizo Komura, ordered evasive maneuvers. 2 of the bombs missed, sending up colossal plumes of water. The third one did not. It was a direct hit. The 1,000-pound or about 450-kilogram bomb smashed into the starboard side of her forward bridge. The explosion was catastrophic. It blew a huge hole in the superstructure, wiped out the bridge crew, and sent shrapnel tearing through the command center. Captain Komura was severely wounded, and the ship's executive officer was killed. Fires erupted, and for a moment it looked like the cruiser might be lost. But her damage control teams were excellent. They fought and contained the blaze. While Chikuma was still under her own power, her command and control was shattered. She was hit again, this time by glancing blows from 2 more bombs that caused further damage to her aircraft deck. Battered and bloodied, with dozens of her crew dead and over 150 wounded, Chikuma was forced to withdraw from the battle. She limped back to the naval base at Truk, and from there to Kure in Japan for extensive repairs. For the next several months, as the fighting raged in the Solomons, Chikuma was out of the war. She returned to the fleet in early 1943, but the nature of the war had changed. The Grand Carrier duels were over for now, replaced by island-hopping campaigns and relentless American submarine warfare. Chikuma spent much of the next year and a half on escort duties, shuttling troops and supplies, and acting as a fleet escort. Her float planes now used more for anti-submarine patrols than for scouting for enemy fleets. She was present at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the infamous Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where Japanese naval aviation was irrevocably shattered. Chikuma herself, however, saw little direct action. Her moment, her final desperate battle, was still to come. By October 1944, Japan was on the ropes. American forces were poised to invade the Philippines, which would sever Japan's vital oil supply lines from the Dutch East Indies. The IJN, a shadow of its former self, concocted a final, desperate gamble. The Shogo 1 plan. It was a complex, almost suicidal plan involving multiple fleets converging on the American invasion force at Leyte Gulf. Chikuma was assigned to the most powerful of these fleets, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurida's center force. This mighty armada of battleships and cruisers, including the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, was to sail through the San Bernardino Strait and fall upon the fragile American landing transports. The plan began to unravel almost immediately. Kurida's force was savaged by American submarines before it even reached the Philippines, losing 2 heavy cruisers. Then, in the Sibuyan Sea, it was subjected to wave after wave of furious air attacks. The super battleship Musashi was sunk after absorbing an incredible amount of punishment. Kurida, believing he was sailing into a trap, temporarily turned his fleet around. But then, a deceptive report arrived, suggesting the American carrier fleets were withdrawing. He turned his ships back towards the San Bernardino Strait. He didn't know he was about to sail directly into one of the most heroic and mismatched naval battles in history. On the morning of October 25, 1944, as Kurida's center force exited the strait, his lookouts spotted something that should not have been there: the masts of American ships. Believing them to be the fast carriers of the U.S. Third Fleet, Kurida ordered a general attack. But these were not fleet carriers. They were Taffy 3, a tiny task unit of 6 slow escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 even smaller destroyer escorts. Their job was to support troops on the ground, not fight a fleet of Japanese battleships. What followed was the battle off Samar, a legendary last stand. Chikuma, along with the rest of Kurida's cruisers, charged forward. For the men of Taffy 3, it was a death sentence. They were facing ships that outgunned, out-armored, and outran them in every conceivable way. Yet, they did not run. The American destroyers, led by the USS Johnston, laid smoke and charged directly at the Japanese cruisers, firing torpedoes and blazing away with their 5-inch guns. The escort carriers launched their planes, armed with whatever they had, some with high-explosive bombs, some with depth charges, some with nothing at all, just to harass and distract the Japanese gunners. In the heart of this melee was Chikuma. She poured fire from her 8-inch guns, targeting the American jeep carriers. She, along with several other cruisers, concentrated their fire on the USS Gambier Bay. the escort carrier, unable to escape the faster Japanese ships, was bracketed by shells and hit repeatedly. She slowed, caught fire, and eventually capsized and sank, the only American carrier in the war to be sunk exclusively by naval gunfire. Chikuma and her compatriots were creating havoc. But Taffy 3's desperate defense was costing the Japanese precious time and sowing confusion. The ferocious, suicidal attacks by the American destroyers and the constant harassment from the air were taking their toll. The American pilots were relentless. They pressed their attacks with incredible courage. A group of TBM Avenger torpedo bombers from the escort carriers swarmed the Japanese cruisers. One of them lined up on Chikuma. Despite the hail of anti-aircraft fire, the pilot got his torpedo away. The weapon ran hot, straight, and true. It slammed into Chikuma's stern. The explosion was immense. It completely sheared off her stern section and wrecked her port engine room. Her rudders were gone. Immediately, Chikuma lost all propulsion and began to drift uncontrollably. Her fight was over. As the rest of Kurida's fleet, confused and battered, would eventually disengage and retreat, the crippled Chikuma was left behind, a sitting duck alone on the vast ocean. The cruiser's story should have ended there, but it was to have one final, tragic chapter. Later that day, the Japanese destroyer Nowaki, also retreating from the battle, came across the stricken Chikuma. The Nowaki was a modern, capable destroyer, and her crew undertook a rescue mission. They came alongside the crippled cruiser and began the difficult process of transferring her surviving crew. Accounts state that almost the entire crew of Chikuma made it aboard the Nowaki. Once the rescue was complete, the Nowaki likely fired her own long-lance torpedoes into the hulk of the Chikuma, sending the proud cruiser to her final resting place at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. Nowaki, her decks packed with hundreds of survivors from Chikuma, turned for home. But her ordeal was not over. The American forces, having dealt with the other Japanese fleets, were now hunting for stragglers. In the dead of night, the Nowaki was spotted by a powerful American cruiser-destroyer group. She was alone, heavily laden, and completely outgunned. The American ships opened fire. The Nowaki, a ship carrying the lives of 2 crews, was blasted apart in a series of devastating explosions. She sank with all hands. From the nearly 1,000 men aboard the destroyer, including the entire rescued crew of the Chikuma, there were no survivors. History records that only a single sailor from Chikuma's original crew, a man who had been left on a Japanese-held island due to illness before the battle, survived the war. The story of the Chikuma is the story of the Imperial Japanese Navy in microcosm. It began with an innovative and brilliant design, a ship that perfectly embodied Japan's naval strategy. She was there for the great victories and the stunning successes of the early war, her eyes guiding the fleet. She endured the brutal turning points, taking heavy damage but surviving through skill and determination. And she met her end in the final, desperate gamble, a chaotic and violent battle against impossible odds, followed by a final, cruel twist of fate that ensured her story and the stories of her crew vanished beneath the waves. She was a true veteran, a hybrid warrior that fought everywhere, saw everything, and deserves to be remembered as one of the most significant and hard-fighting warships of the Second World War. We've journeyed through the triumphs and tragedies of this unique warship, but the archives of history are deep, and countless stories are still waiting to be told. If you found yourself captivated by the tale of this hybrid warrior, make sure you are subscribed to the channel, because we are always on the hunt for new targets and forgotten legends. We also want to put you in command of our next mission. What piece of military history, legendary machine, or untold story should we investigate next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. Consider it your mission briefing to us. Your idea could very well become our next feature. Thank you for watching.